Hey guys, tonight we drift back into the aftermath of one of history's darkest chapters, the world right after the Black Death. Picture yourself walking along a cobbled street, the air damp with the smell of wood smoke, but the soundscape is eerily thin. A cart squeaks, a raven caws, but the laughter of children and the buzz of crowded markets are gone. You probably won't survive this stroll, not because of the plague now, but because the emptiness could drive anyone a little mad. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge further down the lane, noticing shutters nailed closed on half the homes. Some houses stand wide open, doorways yawning, as if the inhabitants walked out mid-meal and never returned. The silence is the most unsettling detail. It's not just quiet, it's the hush of lives abruptly cut short. You imagine yourself as one of the lucky survivors navigating through towns where entire streets have no one left to complain about rent or gossip about neighbors. Mainstream history tells us that between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed somewhere between a third and half of Europe's population. That number still boggles the mind. Imagine every second person on your block simply vanishing. The aftermath left more than grief. It reshaped the very bones of communities. Cities shrank, villages were abandoned, and the sound of bells tolling funerals seemed to linger even after the last death cart rolled by. And yet, alongside the tragedy came a strange new opportunity. You stumble into a marketplace that once overflowed with merchants but now has just a few stands. A lone vendor offers turnips and stale bread, his voice echoing down empty alleys. Because so many mouths are gone, food is suddenly plentiful for survivors. You, with your one coin, can buy a basketful instead of a single apple. Scarcity flips to abundance, and the world feels off balance. A quirky tidbit whispers its way into your thoughts. Some people left their houses with meals half-eaten, bread still warm, as if the plague's speed mocked any attempt at closure. Archaeologists have even uncovered bowls of porridge, centuries old, carbonized on abandoned hearths. The little details reveal the scale of disruption better than statistics ever could. The streets tell their own story too. You pass faded chalk crosses on doors where victims once lived. Bits of fabric stuffed into cracks show where people tried to block bad air from seeping inside. Cats stalk rats openly without anyone swatting them away, and somewhere a bell still clangs, out of habit more than necessity. Historians still argue whether most townspeople fled at the height of the pestilence or whether they clung stubbornly to their homes. You picture both, deserted villages swallowed by weeds and others stubbornly patching roofs, as though normal life might return with enough determination. As you walk further, you notice how survivors have a new expression, haunted but oddly liberated. With so many gone, debts were cancelled, old grudges forgotten, and power structures scrambled. A beggar might suddenly inherit land because the entire family above them on the family tree has perished. Life becomes a bizarre lottery, with fortune and misfortune drawn from the same hat. The sensory detail presses in. The air smells of damp moss where homes have begun to rot. Windows rattle, untended. You step inside a church. Benches empty, candles melted down to nubs. The priest's sermon echoes off stone walls delivered to only 3 or 4 parishioners. Faith feels thinner here, like a stretched cloth. But despite the grief, you also sense the tiniest crack of opportunity, like sunlight slipping through shutters. People whisper of moving into abandoned homes, claiming orchards that no one else tends, or simply enjoying bread and meat without worrying about tomorrow's shortage. The plague ended lives, yes, but it also rewrote the map of survival. As you continue walking through these hollow towns, the duality of silence and possibility weighs on you. It's unsettling to know you could scoop up land just by planting your boots on it, yet it's even more unsettling to realize the price paid for that freedom. The aftermath of the Black Death is less about corpses now and more about the eerie calm, the gaps left behind, and the sense that history itself has reset the game. The street narrows, grass creeping through cracks, and you realize this is the opening act of a much longer transformation. These empty homes, abandoned meals, and whispered debates are only the beginning of a Europe staggering forward, and you, wandering in second-person trance, will keep drifting with it. You drift onward, leaving behind the hollow streets and stepping into the realm of faith, or perhaps more accurately, the wobbling tightrope of belief after the Black Death. Imagine yourself entering a modest chapel, the stone walls damp, the scent of incense clinging like a heavy curtain. The pews are mostly empty, though a few survivors kneel in prayer, their whispers half pleas, half bargains. For some, the devastation is a divine punishment that can only be answered with deeper devotion. For others, the silence of heaven feels unbearable, proof that perhaps nobody's listening at all. You sit quietly, noticing how two kinds of people emerge in this shaken landscape, the penitent and the skeptic. The penitent walk barefoot through town squares, lashing their own backs with cords, blood spotting their tunics as they chant hymns of sorrow. They believe the plague was sent to scourge human sin, and only pain or prayer can balance the scales. Then there are the skeptics, leaning against tavern walls with their mugs of ale, muttering that if the priests and monks couldn't stop the death, maybe the priests never had the answers in the first place. The mainstream fact you overhear whispered again and again: monasteries were decimated by the plague. Entire brotherhoods died, and with them the institutional backbone of medieval faith cracked. Some monasteries vanished forever, their libraries locked and lost, their bells falling silent. That absence rippled outward. Villagers who once turned to monks for help found only locked gates and overgrown cloisters. And then the quirky detail. In certain places, terrified worshippers thought church bells themselves could ward off sickness, so they rang them endlessly, hour after hour, until people begged for quiet. Picture yourself dozing off in your narrow bed, while the iron tongue of the bell clangs at midnight, a sound less like salvation and more like a headache. You glance around the chapel and notice graffiti scratched into the stone, a rough carving of a skull beside the words, "God, why us?" It's crude but heartfelt, the medieval version of writing in the comment section. Survivors demanded answers, and when they didn't get them, the questions etched themselves into walls. Historians still argue whether the Black Death permanently weakened the authority of the Church or merely shook it temporarily. Did the seeds of Protestant Reformation begin here, in the silence of unanswered prayers, or was it simply a passing crisis of confidence, with most believers eventually returning to their rosaries and altars? The debate remains unsettled, and you, wandering the aisles, can feel both possibilities pressing in. A priest climbs the pulpit, his voice cracking as he insists that sin brought the plague and only repentance can prevent its return. You glance at the congregation. Half are nodding solemnly, others glance sideways with barely concealed doubt. That split, right there, is the fragile hinge of faith after catastrophe. As you step back outside, you see the visual clash continue. Processions of flagellants march past, their chants echoing through empty squares, while taverns across the street fill with laughter, dice games, and a sense that if death could strike at any time, better to squeeze every last drop of pleasure from the moment. You find yourself in the middle of that tension, one ear catching the hymn, the other the clink of mugs. The air smells of candle wax, sweat, and stale beer, a blend of sanctity and sin. You can almost hear the unspoken thought in everyone's mind: if God let half the world perish, perhaps survival is proof you've been chosen, or perhaps it's just dumb luck. Faith, once a steady anchor, now feels slippery in your hands. For every monk preaching salvation, there's a peasant muttering that priests didn't bury their dead fast enough. For every pilgrim trudging toward Rome, there's a young man deciding the tavern's back room is holier than any altar. And so, as you wander further, the aftershocks of belief rumble under your feet. The plague didn't just kill people. It fractured certainty, sending cracks racing through the very idea of divine order. You walk into the night with those cracks widening, and the faint sound of both bells and laughter following you down the... You carry on, leaving behind the echo of bells and the drunken laughter, and soon the open countryside stretches before you. The villages you pass look oddly reshaped, their fields either wildly overgrown or freshly ploughed by hands that never tilled them before. Survivors trudge across muddy ground with rough sacks slung over their shoulders. You notice something subtle but powerful happening here. peasants begin reclaiming fields, reshaping the very balance of wealth and work in Europe. You feel the weight of scythes swinging through wheat as families spread out across land that once belonged to lords who are now dust in a shallow grave. The air carries the scent of damp soil, manure, and the faint sweetness of wildflowers overtaking abandoned plots. Where once serfs were bound tightly to estates, now the ropes of obligation have frayed. With so many workers gone, demand for hands soars, and for the first time in living memory, peasants taste leverage. The historical fact is straightforward. Labour shortages following the plague created enormous bargaining power for peasants. In England, for instance, wages nearly doubled in some regions during the decades after the Black Death. A ploughman who once scraped by with stale bread now demanded fresh meat and coin. You imagine the shock of a noble hearing a peasant say, "Pay me more or I'll walk." It's the medieval equivalent of a workers' strike, except armed with hoes instead of placards. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some peasants literally abandoned farming for good, wandering into towns and setting themselves up in entirely new trades. Blacksmiths, bakers, even tavern owners, claiming skills they didn't always have. Imagine you walking into a village announcing, "Yes, I am a professional brewer," when the only thing you've brewed before is disappointment. Yet, with no one left to question, doors opened and new livelihoods sprouted. Historians still argue whether this moment was the true birth of a European middle class or just a temporary swell of freedom before lords slammed the doors shut again. Did the serfs permanently break chains of feudalism, or did new restrictions tighten once populations recovered? As you walk, you can almost sense both outcomes flickering, a hopeful shimmer of freedom in one direction, a tightening shadow of authority in the other. You trudge along a rutted track where oxen pull carts creaking under sheaves of wheat. A boy runs beside, tossing rocks at crows. His family is working land that once belonged to 3 other households, people gone, their fields absorbed. This patchwork of ownership reshapes communities overnight. Entire villages relocate closer to richer soil or safer rivers. In some places, new hamlets rise like mushrooms after rain. In others, land simply lies fallow, weeds spreading like silent invaders. At the edge of one field, you see a peasant family feasting on roasted goose, something once reserved for feast days, now part of an ordinary supper. Bread, meat, and ale flow more freely as the math of scarcity flips. You feel the heady satisfaction in their laughter, survival rewarded with abundance. But there's also guilt. Every bite of goose reminds them of neighbours who will never taste again. One peasant tells you with a smirk that he now wears a fur-lined cloak bought from the estate of a dead noble. It fits poorly, but he struts proudly, as though wearing history's joke on his shoulders. Luxury items trickle down in strange ways. Gold brooches, carved furniture, embroidered linens, all shuffled into the hands of those who never expected to touch them. Still, cracks remain in this rosy picture. Lords and kings notice the shift and don't like it one bit. In England, the infamous Statute of Labourers, 1351, tries to freeze wages back to pre-plague levels, forbidding peasants from charging excessive rates. Imagine the absurdity. Half the workers are gone, fields risk going barren, and yet lawmakers wag their fingers, demanding peasants know their place. You can almost hear the collective medieval eye roll. In some places, this tension boils into outright rebellion. Decades later, uprisings like the English Peasants' Revolt, 1381, shake kingdoms. You wander past a tavern where a group of farmers whisper over mugs of ale, voices low but sharp, talk of freedom, of refusing tithes, of lords who demand too much while giving nothing. The seeds of revolt are watered in these alehouses. The sensory details of the countryside press in, the buzz of flies over dung heaps, the clang of iron shoes on cobblestone, the rustle of wind through unmown hay. You feel how alive the land is and how desperate survivors are to bend it to their will. Each acre tilled is both a victory and a reminder of the countless hands missing from the soil. You pause by a crumbling manor, its gates rusted, ivy climbing the walls. No lord walks its halls anymore, only goats nibbling at weeds in the courtyard. A peasant child dashes inside, giggling as he chases chickens across the abandoned banquet hall. Power has shifted, not by declaration, but by absence. This countryside, so ordinary in its smells and sounds, is the silent stage for a revolution. Labor has worth, survival has leverage, and you, trudging among them, feel the ground itself tilting toward a new balance. The peasants reclaim fields, and with them, a piece of dignity once denied. The world is changing, not with trumpets or proclamations, but with muddy boots and calloused hands pressing seed into soil. And somewhere in the distance, faint but insistent, a church bell rings again, reminding you that though the fields may bloom anew, the echo of death still lingers in every furrow. You leave behind the muddy fields and creaking wagons, stepping into a bustling market square that feels both familiar and newly strange. The clang of hammers and the chatter of merchants fill the air. But the crowd is thinner, the faces fewer, and every stall seems to gleam with opportunity. What you notice first is that wealth itself is on the move, flowing in directions it never dared before. Survivors are not just reclaiming land, they are building new fortunes. The plague left gaps in every chain of business. Merchants vanished mid-voyage, artisans died with their secrets half-taught, and bankers lost both clients and heirs. Into those gaps marched the lucky and the ambitious. You pause at a stall draped in silks dyed scarlet and indigo. The merchant behind it wears a ring that could buy a farm, his grin wide as he calls out prices that seem oddly high, yet buyers still lean in. He tells you his ships now face less competition. Every risk at sea promises greater rewards. Trade routes reopen slowly, but those who survive learn to exploit them fiercely. The mainstream historical fact is clear. The decades after the Black Death saw a surge in the fortunes of merchants and traders. With aristocrats weakened and labor empowered, commerce became a stronger ladder of advancement. Italian city-states like Venice and Florence grew rich on trade, while England and the Low Countries thrived on wool. You can almost hear the whisper of gold coins slipping into purses as merchants take advantage of shortages and booming demand. Here's a quirky tidbit. Survivors sometimes bought entire wardrobes at bargain prices from the estates of the dead. Imagine trying on a velvet robe that once belonged to a duke, sleeves dragging in the dirt, then wearing it proudly to market like a child in oversized pajamas. Wealth wasn't just coin, it was physical stuff, and suddenly that stuff flows downward like never before. Historians still argue whether this redistribution of wealth permanently shifted European society, or if it was only a temporary hiccup until populations recovered. Was the rise of merchant power a direct gift of the plague, or merely an acceleration of trends already in motion? You can sense the debate hanging in the air, as if every clang of a blacksmith's hammer is also an argument about causation. You wander past goldsmiths' stalls, dazzled by gleaming chalices and delicate chains. One man explains that nobles, desperate for cash after losing tenants and income, sold family heirlooms at laughable prices. He chuckles as he tells you he bought a jeweled dagger, fit for a king, from a widow who needed bread more than pride. In the background, apprentices melt down coins and broken ornaments, recasting them into brighter, newer treasures. The sensory overload is sharp. Spice sellers shout about cinnamon, saffron, and peppercorns, their scents clinging to the humid air. A butcher swings a cleaver into a slab of beef, juices dripping onto the stones. Somewhere a musician plucks a lute, hoping a merchant with jingling purses will toss him a coin. The market is alive again, but with an edgier energy. People know death still lurks, and that awareness sharpens their appetite for wealth and pleasure. You overhear one merchant boasting that he now owns 3 warehouses along the harbour, all inherited from cousins, too unlucky to dodge the plague. His smirk is wide, his purse wider. It's unsettling, this mix of grief and greed, like watching someone buy their neighbour's house while the funeral bell still tolls. Yet this is how new wealth rises, not quietly but boldly, with rings glittering in the sun. In a corner tavern, you notice clerks hunched over parchment, scribbling accounts faster than ever. Banking houses, especially in Italy, begin experimenting with letters of credit, making trade smoother across long distances. The plague taught survivors that physical goods could vanish overnight, but paper promises, surprisingly, held power. You sip watered wine and realize you're watching the foundations of modern finance being laid in these ink stains. At the edge of the square, you see a ragged child wearing a necklace of polished shells, insisting it's magic against sickness. A merchant laughs and buys it anyway, slipping the trinket into his purse beside glittering coins. The collision of superstition and commerce feels oddly fitting. Fear itself has become a marketable product. One woman, draped in crimson velvet, leans close to you and whispers that she bought her wealth not through trade, but through marriage. With so many heirs dead, widows inherited lands and businesses, and many remarried quickly, combining fortunes. The plague didn't just make merchants richer, it made room for women to step into roles once barred. The air seems thick with reinvention, people stitching new identities from loss and opportunity. And yet you sense unease. The richer merchants grow, the more the old nobility sneer, claiming true power lies in bloodlines, not coins. Still, coins ring louder in the market square than a faded family crest. You wonder whether history itself is tilting toward commerce, even as kings and dukes cling to crumbling thrones. The sun dips lower, casting long shadows over stalls, and you realize this square is more than just a place of trade. It's a symbol of survival's reward. The plague burned away old wealth, leaving space for new fortunes to sprout. Every silken sleeve, every golden chalice, every clink of coin is proof that wealth, like life, flows in unexpected directions when death clears the board. As you step out of the square, the laughter of merchants trails behind you. The rise of new wealth hums like background music, a steady tune of coins on wood, of fortunes made from absence. And you, wandering forward, feel how this rhythm will echo long after the last memory of plague has faded. You step back into a city that breathes like a great old animal, stone ribs rising, timber lungs creaking, while masons' hammers ping against chisels in a rhythm you feel in your feet. You wander past scaffolds that web the walls of a half-finished guild hall, and you catch that chalky tang of limestone dust coating your tongue. The square you crossed before the plague looked cramped and shadowed. Now, after so much loss, it opens like a palm. Stalls are pushed outward, alleys shaved wider, windows cut to pull in cleaner air. You keep moving, noticing how survival turns into carpentry, how memory becomes mortar. The mainstream fact hums above the noise. In the generations after the Black Death, many European towns poured resources into repair and redesign. New conduits for water, stricter rules about waste, cemeteries shifted beyond crowded walls, even fresh market charters that separated animals from people. City councils, suddenly aware that filth might feed catastrophe, began writing ordinances that sound oddly modern: keep streets swept, move tanneries and slaughterhouses outside the centre, stop dumping refuse into fountains. You watch a sergeant of the watch bark at a butcher hauling offal in a leaking pail, and the butcher grumbles and turns his cart toward the river gate, farther downstream. Not a perfect solution. Fish stew is definitely cancelled tonight, but an improvement. You slow by a work gang spreading crushed stone into a muddy lane. A foreman tells you they'll cap it with timber blocks where wagons rattle worst so the muck won't swallow wheels after rain. Someone jokes that the road eats carts the way a drunk eats bread. Too fast, no chewing. You laugh softly and keep walking, half pleased to be in a world where jokes return with the carts. A bell rings from a tower, and for a second you brace for dread. Then you remember it's just the workday's end, not another warning of death. Progress is sometimes nothing more than a bell that means go home. On a side street you find a crew painting a house with lime wash, the slurry bright as milk. They say the white reflects light, sweetens the air, and keeps foul vapours from nesting in the plaster. Quirky as it sounds, the city pays a small tax rebate for fresh lime on facades, beauty as public health. You run a fingertip along the drying coat. It stings like a small truth that stares back. Fear colours walls as much as fashion. You pause at a fountain buzzing with bees. A clerk is reading aloud a new list of rules. No animals bathing in the basin, no washing plague laundry where people draw drinking water, and no emptying chamber pots from upper windows between sunrise and sunset. From the look of the street, that last rule is a mercy. You angle your hat just in case someone hasn't gotten the memo. Light joke number 2, nothing says urban planning like not needing an umbrella on a sunny day. Historians still argue whether these urban changes truly cut mortality or mostly calmed anxieties and tidied appearances. Did wider lanes and relocated trades blunt future outbreaks, or did people simply grab comforting levers while the real culprits, fleas, rats and germs unborn in human knowledge, kept scurrying underfoot? You sift those questions like gravel through your hands, not sure what stays and what falls away. You pass a churchyard gate chained shut. A placard explains that new burial grounds lie beyond the northern field, outside the walls where winds are better. A delicate way of saying, keep the dead a little farther from the living. The ground nearby sinks slightly where older graves collapse. A gardener rakes the bumps smooth, humming. He points you toward a lane that used to choke with pigs. Now a bylaw keeps swine out of the center unless ringed and led. The city smells different, less barnyard, more bakery. You decide the bakers deserve a saint. At the edge of the market, a mason's lodge has pinned up drawings. A boulder roofline to push smoke skyward, a raised walkway so rainwater sluices away from doorsteps, an arcaded gallery where merchants can keep business under shelter but in the open air. You trace the lines with your eyes and hear the calcified wisdom behind them. Light, space, and air. Those 3 quiet healers. A boy runs past carrying a basket of clay tiles. He was probably the same boy you saw in the fields throwing rocks at crows, now repurposed by the city's hunger for hands. You find one of those hands attached to a woman carpenter shaping a beam with a broad axe. She grins when you stare and says, less people means more work for the rest of us, and I'm not letting the men have all the roofs. You offer a nod like a toast. She tells you that guilds are re-evaluating rules, apprentices promoted early, journeymen skipping tests if they can simply do the thing. A new ladder of skill rises where an old one snapped. The city can't wait for perfect paperwork. A notary waves you into a half-ruined cloister being converted into an infirmary. Beds line the nave where monks once sang. Windows have been knocked larger, slats swivel to direct breezes. A physician holds a pomander to his nose and insists the airflow keeps corruption from settling. It may not stop disease, but it does cool your skin, and you take the gift. The clerk mentions that some councils fund pest houses on the outskirts, simple buildings where the sick can be kept away. The idea is rough and often cruel, but also startling. The city is learning to manage bodies, not only souls. In the Tanner's Quarter, now across the river, you gag at the vats as hides stew in urine, oak bark, and thyme. The relocation hasn't improved the smell, but at least the wind spares the market. A tanner shrugs and offers a slice of hard cheese to compensate for or the assault. You accept. Joke 3 writes itself. The cheese smells better than the street, which is saying something, and it's still delicious. A municipal scribe tells you about new night soil routes. Carts must follow set paths out to dumping grounds where gardeners turn muck into compost. It's organized filth, an oxymoron that strangely comforts you. Lantern posts appear at regular intervals, required for crossings where carts and pedestrians mix. A small boy has the job of lighting them at dusk, and you silently root for him like he's racing time. Some corners mourn instead of build. You stride through a ward where half the houses still slump, their timbers black with age and rain. Not every block rises at once, and not every city chooses the same cures. One town widens streets, another bans thatch, a third insists on brick over timber. The patchwork makes a certain sense, the way grief sits differently in each household. You remember that fur-lined cloak on a peasant's shoulders, the strange descent of luxury, and you realize cities wear their losses differently too. Some sew new hems, others let the fabric fray. A curious side note drifts across your path. A guild of bell founders posts a notice offering smaller, sweeter bells, arguing that gentler tones calm the spirit and promote health. You smirk, thinking of the midnight clanging that once rattled your bones. Sound becomes architecture too in this nervous society. At a ridge of new wall you look down over rooftops like a shoal of red fish. Rain gutters angle towards cisterns. Public fountains take their gurgle from spring-fed conduits that snake in from hills. A mason says the conduit took 2 years and too many lives to lay. Collapsed tunnels, bad air underground, but now the water runs clearer. You cup it in your hands and drink. It tastes like stone, like effort, like a city deciding to lift its own throat to the source. Still, the debate paces you like a faithful dog. Are these reborn streets truly healthier, or simply more organized reflections of fear? Historians still argue whether the plague catalyzed a revolution in urban governance or merely accelerated changes that were already hammering into place. You're not sure. But you know the hammer keeps striking, the walls rise, the lanes breathe wider, and the city's heartbeat steadies from panicked flutter to something like a resting pulse. The sun slides along the scaffolds and the whitewash glows peach. Workers coil ropes, stack tools, and shout goodnights you can almost catch by name. You stand in the square again, aware that grief paid for every inch of space at your elbows. The city is not healed, not safe, not finished. But it is reborn enough that you can walk it without ducking your head, reborn enough that the bell at dusk sounds like promise rather than warning. You turn down a newly laid street and let the stones remember your footsteps. You leave behind the clang of chisels and scaffolds, stepping into twilight streets where the lamps flicker, their glow pooling like melted butter on the cobbles. People shuffle past you, heads low, scarves pulled high, eyes darting with unease. Even though the worst of the Black Death has passed, fear lingers like smoke after a fire, thick, acrid, impossible to forget. The plague may have ended, but in people's minds, it's never taken, really gone. You notice how families cling to rituals meant to keep sickness at bay. A woman sprinkles vinegar on her doorstep every morning, muttering that it drives away foul vapors. Another hangs sprigs of rosemary and lavender in her window, the scent so sharp it tickles your nose. Children wear little pouches around their necks filled with herbs pressed tightly to their chests like stuffed animals against the dark. It's comforting and absurd all at once, like wearing garlic to scare off vampires. The mainstream historical fact here is clear. Long after the plague wave subsided, Europeans remained convinced that foul air, miasma, was the lurking culprit. Homes were fumigated with smoke, streets were perfumed with juniper, and fires burned in marketplaces to cleanse the air. The rituals didn't stop plague, of course, but they did shape how entire towns lived and breathed for centuries afterward. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some towns, people believed loud noises scared sickness away. So when rumors of plague returned, citizens banged pots, rang bells, and even fired cannons into the sky. You imagine trying to sleep while your neighbors blast a medieval soundtrack of chaos at midnight. Fear creates some questionable playlists. Historians still argue whether these practices had any practical impact beyond psychological comfort. Did the smoke and herbs at least repel fleas, or were they nothing more than scented illusions? You stand in a street that smells of burning sage and wood smoke, wondering if these layers of ritual were medicine, placebo, or just desperate theatre. You pass a tavern where the air is thick with chatter. Men argue whether the plague ever truly left or if it merely hides, waiting. A grizzled old farmer swears he saw black swellings again in a neighbouring village, while a young mason insists that's just gossip. The uncertainty hangs in a room like a sour ale left too long. Fear makes storytellers out of everyone. Walking further, you find charms nailed to doors, iron horseshoes, saintly medallions, even animal bones hung like trophies. Each doorway becomes a little fortress against the invisible enemy. Some families sleep in shifts, keeping candles burning all night as if light itself might bar disease from entering. You feel the exhaustion in their eyes. They survived once, and they are determined not to tempt fate again. You pause at a healer's stall. The man waves a feather duster soaked in vinegar around your head. insisting it cleanses your aura. You cough, not from plague but from the vinegar sting. He assures you it's working. It's a flimsy reassurance, but people hand him coins anyway. Fear, you realize, is the most reliable currency in town. In a narrow alley you hear whispered prayers. Families kneel in front of a crudely painted saint, candles flickering in cracked glass jars. They murmur for protection, their voices hushed, urgent. Faith blends with superstition until you can't tell which is which. Some still carry painted charms of Saint Roch, the plague saint, believing his dog who licked his sores offers divine protection. It's half devotion, half talisman, but entirely human. The sensory experience presses in. You smell vinegar, burning herbs, damp earth and smoke. You hear the constant clink of charms against wooden doorframes, the muffled coughs people try to hide, the scraping footsteps of those avoiding eye contact. Every sound carries the weight of dread. Even daily life bends under fear. Bakers keep loaves covered, convinced plague could settle on flour. Butchers salt meat heavily, claiming it blocks corruption. Parents warn children not to chase rats, though the irony is lost on them, since the very rats may still be the true carriers. The world feels cautious, paranoid, and oddly tender all at once. One evening you wander into the countryside, and a farmer shows you how he lights fires in every corner of his orchard, filling the air with a smoky haze. He insists the smoke keeps the sickness from returning. His wife nods firmly, then offers you a slice of bread thick with honey, as though comfort is part of the prescription. Historians still argue whether fear itself became a survival tool. Did vigilance help communities react faster to later outbreaks, or did paranoia only deepen suffering? You can't answer. All you know is that as you walk back into town, each window glows faintly with herbs dangling above it, each doorway clinks faintly with charms, and each family peers out as if waiting for a shadow they cannot name. The plague has ended, yes, but it's everywhere still. In the way people breathe shallow, in the way they light candles, in the way they hold their children tighter at night. The true infection now is memory, and that is one disease no one can cure. You push open a heavy oak door into a dim chamber that smells of ink, wax, and dried herbs. A physician hunches at a table littered with scrolls, diagrams, and bowls of unidentifiable goo. He's muttering to himself as he dips a quill into ink, scratching out yet another recipe for survival. You watch from the corner, realizing that in this new world, medicine is less science and more an elaborate guessing game dressed in expensive robes. The mainstream fact here is sobering. Medical knowledge in the 14th century was painfully limited. Doctors still relied heavily on the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, ancient authorities whose ideas centered around humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you had too much phlegm, you were sluggish. Too much bile, you were hot-tempered. The Black Death, devastating as it was, didn't immediately rewrite this system. Instead, physicians tried to shove the horror into their old frameworks, like jamming a dragon into a birdcage. You look over a physician's shoulder as he writes, "Take ground emerald, mix with rose water, and drink before sunrise." Another note recommends applying a paste of crushed pearls and honey to buboes. Somewhere, an apothecary insists powdered sapphire cures shortness of breath. You chuckle softly, jewel dust, as healthcare sounds less like medicine and more like a medieval luxury smoothie. But there were earthy remedies too. People brewed concoctions of garlic, onions, and wine. They pressed herbs like sage and rosemary into poultices. They hung dried toads around their necks, believing the animal would suck the poison out. You picture yourself wandering into a healer's stall, asked whether you'd prefer your cure sautéed, smoked, or hopping. Quirky tidbit. In some towns, doctors recommended rubbing a live chicken against plague swellings, feathers and all, then burying the bird alive to draw out the sickness. The unlucky chicken, sacrificed in the name of hope, clucked its final protest while patients prayed. You can almost hear the sound now, a frantic squawk followed by silence, as if medicine itself sighed and gave up. Historians still argue whether these treatments helped at all. Did the herbs offer mild antibacterial benefits, or were they entirely symbolic comfort? Was wine merely numbing pain, or could its alcohol cleanse wounds slightly? The debate continues, each new paper arguing whether medieval medicine was hopeless folly or a stumbling step toward progress. You wander into another room where a man in a long, beaked mask shuffles past. The mask, stuffed with herbs and spices, was meant to filter bad air. It looks theatrical, even absurd, but you feel a shiver as the beak turns toward you. The mask has become a symbol, half protective gear, half nightmare. Children cry when they see it, yet people still trust the men behind them, desperate for anything resembling expertise. One physician proudly shows you a chart of zodiac signs, explaining how the stars influence outbreaks. He insists Mars and Saturn's alignment poisoned the air, making plague inevitable. He advises bloodletting under certain constellations, claiming balance will be restored. You nod politely, though the thought of someone draining blood under a starlit sky feels more ritual than cure. In the marketplace, healers hawk miracle potions, bottles of colored liquid, powders wrapped in parchment, amulets promising health, all for sale at inflated prices. You overhear a merchant chuckle, admitting he sells plain water as holy spring tonic. People hand over coins anyway. Fear is not just a currency, it's a booming economy. And yet you also sense the earliest stirrings of real change. A few scholars, unsatisfied with astrology and humors, begin observing symptoms more carefully, comparing cases, and even keeping written records. You peek at one such notebook. Drawings of swellings, lists of fevers, attempts to trace patterns. Crude epidemiology is born not from certainty but from desperation. In a smoky tavern, men debate whether plague spreads from person to person or rides invisible through the air. One insists he caught it from a neighbor's breath, another swears it came from tainted grain. Their mugs slam, their voices rise, and you realize you're overhearing the earliest debates about contagion. Historians still argue which side was closer to the truth, but in that dim tavern, both are clinging to answers that feel too thin. The sensory overload presses in, the sting of vinegar-soaked cloths hanging near doors, the sickly sweet aroma of herbs burning in braziers, the sharp tang of garlic on breath. You hear the scrape of quills, the frantic chanting of healers mixing herbs, the quiet sob of a patient who knows none of it will work. And through it all, a kind of weary sarcasm seeps into daily life. You hear one man joke, "At least the chicken had a decent burial." Another mutter, "If sapphire dust worked, I'd be healthier than a king." Humor becomes medicine too, a small relief against the endless experiments. As you leave the healer's quarters, the street greets you with its mix of hope and futility. Medicine here is not science as you know it. It is theater, ritual, superstition, and the tiniest flicker of observation. But you can feel the weight of curiosity pressing forward, even if clumsily. The plague may have broken faith in priests, but it also cracked open a door for those who dared to ask why. You walk onward carrying the smell of herbs in your hair, the echo of questions in your ears, and the sense that medicine is stumbling slowly toward the... You wander onward into a hall where candlelight flickers against damp stone, shadows stretching like skeletons dancing on the walls. The mood here is different, somber yet strangely creative. You notice the paintings first, murals of pale skeletons linking arms with dukes, priests, and peasants, all swaying in a grim parody of a country dance. The dance of death, they call it, and you stand transfixed by the strange comfort of equality. Everybody, rich or poor, eventually gets invited to this final ball. The mainstream historical fact is simple enough. Art and culture after the Black Death became obsessed with death itself. From illuminated manuscripts to wall paintings, skeletons and decayed bodies appeared everywhere as symbols of both warning and resignation. Music, too, grew darker, with chants and hymns echoing the sorrow of a population scarred by loss. You glance at a choir rehearsing a hymn, their voices rising in minor tones that shiver the candle flames. And then comes the quirky detail. Some artists painted skeletons wearing jaunty hats or carrying wine goblets, as though mocking death itself. One mural you pass shows a skeleton playing a fiddle while a cardinal tries to keep up in clumsy dance steps. You smirk at the absurdity, a medieval version of dark humor graffiti. Imagine walking into church only to see your fate wearing a party hat. Grim, yes, but also undeniably cheeky. Historians still argue whether this death art was meant to frighten viewers back into religious obedience or simply to help communities process grief through shared symbolism. Was it a tool of control, or was it collective therapy on stone walls? You linger in the candlelight, unsure whether to feel unsettled or oddly soothed. You shuffle deeper into a cloister where an apprentice monk illuminates a manuscript. Gold leaf shimmers against an image of St. Michael standing over a field of corpses. The monk tells you softly that he doesn't paint to terrify, but to remind himself that life is fleeting, so every prayer matters. You nod, though part of you wonders if he's also painting because it's the only way to wrestle the nightmare into shape. In another corner of the city, you stumble across a troupe of performers. Their stage is little more than barrels and planks, but the crowd laughs as they parody death itself, actors in crude skull masks chasing maidens and merchants. A man in the crowd nudges you and whispers, "If you can laugh at him, maybe he'll leave you be." Humor, art, faith, they all blur into survival strategies, half distraction, half defiance. The sensory detail is overwhelming. Incense curls through the air of churches, heavy with dirges, while outside, travelling minstrels sing songs of lost loves and ghostly returns. Tapestries depict forests filled with owls and wolves, metaphors for plague's stealth. Even clothing shifts. You notice mourners adopting darker fabrics, muted colours, and more sombre styles, fashion itself carrying a shadow of death. In one square, you see a painting freshly unveiled, a grotesque tableau of plague victims lying side by side, their faces half decayed, while angels carry away their souls. Children stare wide-eyed, and parents cross themselves quickly, yet no one looks away. The artwork forces people to keep company with death, a way of making the unspeakable visible. Nearby, a carver chisels tomb effigies in marble, but instead of idealized knights in shining armor, these effigies show bodies emaciated, ribs exposed, faces slack. The transy tomb becomes a new fashion, memorials that depict not glory but rot. You run your hand across one stone cheekbone and shiver. It's brutally honest art, confronting decay head-on. You hear street musicians strike up a dirge on fiddles and pipes. Their tune is haunting, mournful yet oddly catchy. People hum along, children skip in rhythm, and you realize even music becomes infused with plague memory. These are not simple laments, but communal soundtracks carried from town to town, reminding everyone that they lived through something massive. And in taverns, of course, songs twist death into jest. One drunken singer belts out a tune about the plague being the landlord who takes no rent. The crowd howls with laughter, mugs slamming against tables. Joke number one of the night, grim but effective. You sip your ale and grin despite yourself. Historians still argue whether this macabre turn in culture held Europe back in gloom or propelled it toward Renaissance breakthroughs. Did constant confrontation with mortality deepen creativity, or did it trap minds in a cycle of morbidity? You're not sure, but as you glance at the skeleton fiddler painted on a wall, you can't deny it has a strange energy. Later, you wander through a graveyard at dusk. Stones tilt crookedly, but many are carved with elaborate symbols. Hourglasses, skulls, bones. Even the graves tell stories now, whispering reminders of time's cruelty. You notice one epitaph scrawled in Latin, "As you are now, so once was I." The stone feels smug, almost cheeky, like the dead cracking jokes at the living's expense. Joke number two lands, courtesy of a corpse with wit. Further on, you find a group of weavers dyeing fabrics in deep blacks and reds. A woman explains that customers want mourning cloth not just for funerals but for daily wear. Black becomes fashionable, not merely solemn. You touch the fabric, it stains your fingertips faintly, a reminder that grief seeps into every thread. Inside a chapel, a stained glass window glows with vivid hues, angels and demons tugging at human souls. The window was commissioned after the plague, meant as both warning and consolation. Sunlight floods through it, casting your skin in patches of red and blue. For a moment you feel both exposed and shielded, like standing inside a story told in light. At last you step back into the open night. The streets are alive, not with denial, but with art. Grim, playful, holy, mocking, all swirling around the same theme. Death is no longer hidden. It dances in murals, sings in taverns, stares from tombstones and peers out of glass windows. You walk onward, realizing the culture itself has absorbed the plague into its marrow, turning terror into imagery, and oddly it feels almost alive. You step away from murals of skeletal fiddlers and tomb effigies, and soon the laughter of taverns fades behind you. Out on the road, the smell of manure and damp hay thickens the air. Fields stretch in every direction, but their owners look different now. You notice something subtle but seismic. The power of nobles, once as unshakable as stone, has begun to crumble. The mainstream historical fact comes quickly to mind. When the Black Death slashed Europe's population, it also slashed the nobility's hold on labor. With so many serfs gone, lords found themselves desperate for workers. Contracts that once chained peasants to land grew flimsy. Serfs demanded wages, walked away from unfair terms, and sometimes simply vanished to find better opportunities. A noble's wealth was land, but land without peasants was nothing but grass. You can almost hear the creak of a seesaw tipping, the peasants heavier now, the nobles scrambling not to hit the ground. A quirky tidbit floats to you from a weary farmer. Some lords actually offered workers roasted meat and ale just to lure them to stay. Imagine the irony, a peasant once begging for scraps, now rejecting his lord's free dinner with a shrug, saying, "Sorry, I've got better offers down the road." It's the medieval version of job hopping, complete with perks. Historians still argue whether these shifts permanently weakened feudalism or if the system eventually reasserted itself when populations recovered. Was this truly the beginning of the end for the medieval aristocracy, or just a temporary crack? As you watch peasants strut with newfound confidence, you can't decide which history will choose. You walk past a manor house where shutters are closed and ivy swallows the gate. The lord of the estate died with no heirs, his retainers scattered, his halls echoing. Peasants now graze their cattle on what was once his private hunting ground. A boy chases a goat across the overgrown courtyard, laughing as though the walls themselves belong to him. Power has shifted quietly, like soil eroding underfoot. But not every noble collapses. In some places, surviving lords lash back hard, tightening rules and enforcing old rights with brutal resolve. You overhear a steward shouting at peasants to work longer hours for the same pay, waving a parchment of decrees from the king. The peasants listen politely, then walk away, hoes slung over shoulders, muttering that he can till the fields himself. You grin. Light joke number 1, medieval passive-aggressiveness at its finest. In another village, you find lords who adapt instead of resist. They lease land for cash rather than labor, collecting rent while peasants farm more independently. These flexible nobles manage to hold on to wealth, even thrive. The contrast is striking. Stubborn lords lose everything, while those willing to bend end up richer. You sense the beginning of a lesson that echoes into modern times. Adapt or be left behind. The sensory details of this countryside scream transition. Horses snort as they pull lighter wagons now managed by peasant families rather than noble retainers. Smoke rises from cottages where families roast meats once reserved for feasts. The clatter of coins rings out in barns as peasants pay small rents directly rather than owing endless unpaid labor. It feels almost revolutionary, though no one dares call it that yet. At a crossroads tavern you overhear heated debate. Nobles complain loudly about ungrateful peasants demanding pay, while peasants laugh into their mugs, boasting of lords begging for their return. A traveling merchant jokes that he's never seen peasants drink so much ale in his life. Joke number 2 delivered right from the bar stool. The atmosphere carries both tension and exhilaration. Some peasants walk taller, chests puffed with pride, knowing they can choose their work. Others still bow low, wary of punishment, uncertain if their newfound freedom will last. You feel caught in the middle of this seesaw world, half old, half new, neither stable. Historians still argue whether this redistribution of power directly paved the way for the Renaissance or if it was only one of many threads pulling Europe forward. Was it economics, or was it cultural shifts, or both? The truth, as always, seems tangled, but as you watch peasants bargain boldly in a market square, you sense that history is leaning toward change. As night falls, you pass a small bonfire where peasants sit roasting meat and singing. They mock nobles with satirical verses, laughing harder than the jokes deserve. Their voices rise into the dark like rebellion disguised as song. Joke number 3 slides into the smoke. A farmer declares that the only crown he respects is the one on his hat of daisies. The group howls with delight, ale spilling on the ground. You linger, letting the warmth of the fire seep into your skin, hearing the crackle of wood, smelling the fat dripping onto coals. Power, once locked tight in castles, now feels looser, more contested, shifting like smoke itself. You realize that you're watching the slow unraveling of an old order. Nobles who once ruled by birthright now depend on peasants who laugh around bonfires. The world has tilted and you're standing in the wobble. You keep walking through the countryside where peasants laugh by bonfires until church bells begin tolling faintly in the distance. Their chimes sound softer now, less commanding, almost uncertain. You follow the sound and soon stand before a grand stone church. Its doors hang open, but the pews inside are patchy, half filled with weary villagers, half left empty by death or disillusion. What you sense most here is fracture. The mainstream historical fact is this: the Black Death dealt a crushing blow to the authority of the Catholic Church. Whole monasteries collapsed, priests died by the hundreds, and communities that once leaned on the Church's promises of salvation found those promises brittle. Some clergy showed extraordinary bravery, tending to the sick until they fell themselves. Others fled their flocks, leaving towns without guidance. The survivors remembered both. Faith remained, but trust cracked. And then comes the quirky detail. In some parishes, locals appointed random survivors as priests, men who had no training at all but could at least mutter prayers over burials. One villager admitted he was chosen simply because he spoke Latinish. Imagine standing at a funeral while your neighbor tries to fake the Mass from memory, holy water in one hand, cheat sheet in the other. The line between sacred and improvised blurred quickly. Historians still argue whether the Black Death planted the earliest seeds of the Protestant Reformation. Did disillusion with the Church's failures lay groundwork for Luther and Calvin centuries later? Or did ordinary people largely return to obedience once fear softened? The debate remains open, like the cracked doors of the church you're standing in now. You step inside. A priest delivers a sermon about God's wrath, voice quivering, insisting sin caused the plague. Yet a few villagers exchange skeptical glances. One mutters that if sin were the cause, the greedy lords should have gone first. Light joke number 1. Even medieval sarcasm takes aim at hypocrisy. You grin quietly and slip further into the shadows. Around the altar, indulgences, slips of parchment claiming to shorten time in purgatory, are still for sale. People line up, clutching coins, desperate to buy forgiveness. But whispers snake through the line. If indulgences worked, would my husband be in the grave? The Church's greatest business model begins to wobble under scrutiny. You watch 2 priests argue at the side of the nave. One insists people must cling harder to faith. The other mutters that new practices are needed, less greed, more charity. Their robes swish like banners in battle, the clash of words sharper than their prayers. You realize the Church itself is not united but split, uncertain how to mend its authority. Outside, you stumble upon a group of traveling preachers. They stand on crates, shouting that Rome has failed, that true salvation lies in smaller, purer congregations. Villagers gather around, nodding. Some toss coins, others cross themselves nervously. You feel the tension. Faith is no longer just one straight path. It's a crossroads littered with arguments. The sensory details press in. Incense clings heavily inside churches, while outside the air is crisp with wood smoke. Bells toll but lack their old weight. Chanting rises in one quarter while mocking songs drift from taverns in another. The soundscape itself feels fractured, like 2 choirs singing different hymns at once. In another town, you see statues of saints draped in cloth to rest their eyes after watching too much suffering. The gesture is tender but strange, people shielding their holy protectors, as if the statues themselves were traumatized. Quirky, yes, but revealing. Faith is wounded, even in marble. At a roadside shrine, women kneel with candles, whispering prayers not to priests but directly to God. One tells you softly, the priests don't always come. God will hear me anyway. That independence is quiet, almost accidental, yet it feels revolutionary. Historians still argue whether popular religion grew stronger or weaker in this moment. Did people double down on private devotion, making faith more personal, or did they turn away entirely? The answer, you realize, is probably both, flickering like the candles in their jars. As night deepens, you pass a tavern where songs mocking bishops echo into the dark. One lyric rhymes prayers with fares, mocking how indulgences are hawked like vegetables in a market. Joke number 2 lands in ale-stained rhythm, and the crowd roars with laughter. A century earlier, such mockery might have earned a whipping. Now it's entertainment. Still, for all the doubt, faith hasn't vanished. Processions continue, relics are paraded through streets, and villagers kneel in genuine tears. Grief and devotion remain tangled. A farmer tells you he doesn't trust priests anymore, but he still trusts God. His words hang in the cool air like a stubborn ember. You walk away from the church, bells tolling behind you, but lighter, less commanding. The church still stands, but its foundations are cracked, its voice contested. And you sense the echo of something larger, the first whispers of reformation carried in the uncertain chime of a bell that no longer rules unquestioned. You drift from the uneasy bells of the church toward a cluster of stone buildings where windows glow faintly with candlelight. The air smells of ink, parchment, and damp wool. A boy rushes past you carrying a stack of books so tall it nearly topples him, and you realize you've stumbled into one of Europe's universities. The rooms are cold, drafty, their benches hard as barn doors, but here minds are busy sharpening. The mainstream historical fact is that universities flourished in the aftermath of the Black Death. Institutions like Oxford, Paris, and Bologna lost scores of students and masters, yet they bounced back, reshaped by the hunger for answers. New chairs in medicine, law, and natural philosophy appeared, and more people, especially the sons of merchants and even the occasional daughter cloistered in convent schools, gained access to learning. The shortage of clergy and scholars actually opened doors to a wider set of students. Knowledge, like land, was redistributed by death. A quirky tidbit greets you when you enter a hall. The professor starts his lecture by reading from Aristotle, then pauses to scold a student for sneezing, clearly a nervous reflex left over from plague paranoia. The poor boy stammers that it was just dust, but half the class edges away. You almost laugh. Even here, amid scrolls and chalkboards, fear of contagion lingers like an uninvited guest. Historians still argue whether universities truly advanced science in this era or merely recycled older knowledge with new gloss. Did the plague push scholars to question tradition, or did it trap them in even more elaborate scholastic debates about angels and humours? You listen to one lecturer passionately arguing that disease comes from divine punishment, while another insists bad air is to blame. Both fill the hall with words, yet neither has proof. It's progress and stagnation braided together. You climb the wooden steps of a lecture theatre. Candles smoke at the edges, making your eyes sting. Students huddle in fur cloaks against the chill, scribbling notes in cramped Latin. The master paces, pointing at a crude diagram of the human body. No organs drawn, just vague circles labelled hot and cold. He insists balance is health, imbalance is death. You suppress a sigh. Still, it's the beginning of system, the attempt to make rules where chaos reigns. In the courtyard, debates spill like beer foam. Young men argue about whether the stars can influence plague, one citing Mars and Saturn's opposition, another dismissing him as a fool. A bold student suggests maybe disease spreads from person to person, not the heavens. His companions laugh nervously, but you can tell the seed of contagion theory has been planted, fragile but alive. Quills scratch in scriptoriums where apprentices copy texts feverishly, trying to replace the volumes lost when monasteries collapsed. Margins fill with doodles, faces, animals, even a plague cart sketched with a cheeky grin. Joke number 1 appears right there in ink, a student's cartoon of a professor dozing in his own lecture. You chuckle. Some traditions never change. The sensory details here feel vivid. Parchment crackles, ink stings your nose, the cold stone floor chills your boots. Bells mark the rhythm of lessons. You catch snippets of Latin, Greek, even awkward French as students stumble through translations. The intellectual energy buzzes like a hive, restless and uncertain. One evening, you join a disputation, essentially a medieval debate club. A student must defend the statement, "The plague is punishment for pride." Another counters with, "The plague is natural corruption of air." The hall erupts in clapping and jeers. It's half philosophy, half entertainment. Yet beneath the noise is something precious, the practice. Ice of questioning. You realize you're watching thought itself stretch new muscles. Historians still argue whether these debates truly mattered or if real progress waited for the Renaissance. But sitting there, candlelight flickering on eager faces, you feel something alive, ideas being tested, words sharpened into tools. Even if they're wrong, the act of questioning is its own quiet revolution. In the refectory, students eat bread, beans, and a little meat. Between bites, they gossip about noble families ruined by plague, about guilds rising, about rumors of heresy spreading. Learning isn't just books here, it's news, debate, speculation. The university becomes a clearinghouse for curiosity. As night falls, you step outside. The stars gleam and you overhear one scholar explaining to another how the heavens dictate fate. His companion shakes his head, muttering, "Maybe it's just the rats." That small mutter hangs in the air like prophecy. Joke number 2, a third student quips, "If rats are the cause, then my cat deserves tenure." The group bursts into laughter. You wander away. The glow of candlelit windows behind you, the sound of quills and debates still humming. Universities after the Black Death are imperfect, still clinging to old masters, yet also daring to ask. They're like children wobbling on new legs. Stumbling, yes, but stepping nonetheless. The road ahead feels fuller of questions than answers, and you, drifting between cloisters and lecture halls, feel the pulse of thought beating harder than before. The plague has left scars but also opened doors, and knowledge is beginning to slip through. You leave the echo of lecture halls behind and slip into narrow streets where the moonlight spills unevenly across crooked timbers. Here whispers grow louder than sermons, and glances over the shoulder feel heavier than scripture. The plague has ended, but its shadow fuels superstition like a bellows on embers. The mainstream historical fact is this: when no one could truly explain the cause of plague, imagination filled the gap. Across Europe, people blamed comets streaking across the sky, the alignment of planets, even the corruption of groundwater. Others swore that Jews poisoned wells, leading to brutal pogroms. The fear of contagion became the fear of someone. You shudder as you picture terrified villagers turning suspicion into violence, trying to trap a shapeless enemy in human form. Then comes a quirky tidbit. Cats became scapegoats in some towns, believed to carry demonic energy that spread plague. Ironically, killing cats only worsened the rat problem, feeding the real carriers. You pause at a doorstep where a family strokes a single surviving tabby like a talisman, whispering that she alone kept death from their door. The cat yawns as if to say, "Yes, I saved you, now feed me." Historians still argue whether superstition deepened because the church faltered or whether people simply needed explanations faster than science could provide. Was it distrust of priests that drove neighbors to blame witches and stars? Or was it a desperate attempt to make sense of chaos? The truth, like the flicker of moonlight on wet stones, feels slippery. As you wander, you hear mutterings of astrology. A traveling fortune teller insists the alignment of Jupiter and Saturn opened a gateway for disease. He waves a chart covered in stars, declaring that unless offerings are made, another wave is coming. Villagers drop coins nervously into his hand. His pockets jingle louder. Han his prophecies. The sensory details press against you. The air smells of tallow smoke and damp wool. You hear the creak of shutters closing, the bark of dogs chasing shadows, the hiss of whispers at windows. Fear itself stalks the streets like an invisible beast. You pass a small group gathered around a pyre, tossing herbs and chanting to banish evil spirits. The smoke curls upward, and one boy sneezes. An elder glares, muttering that sneezing invites demons. Joke number 1 slips into your mind. If sneezing truly invited demons, then half the hay fever sufferers in history should have been possessed. Farther along, you encounter an old woman selling charms from a basket. Knotted strings, bones painted red, bottles filled with cloudy liquid. She claims each one guards against plague's return. People line up, clutching coins, convinced her trinkets are insurance policies against death. One man ties a bone charm to his cap and struts proudly as if invincible. You whisper under your breath, "Sir, it's still just a chicken bone." Historians still argue whether such superstitions gave people psychological resilience or if they simply distracted from meaningful solutions. Did charms ease minds enough to let communities function, or did they blind people to more practical measures like cleanliness and quarantine? The balance is unclear, but you can see the comfort on faces clutching charms, and maybe that alone mattered. You pass a family gazing at the night sky. A bright comet streaks across, and the father mutters that it's a harbinger of doom. His daughter, wide-eyed, asks if doom looks pretty. Joke number 2 tumbles out of her mouth, unintentional but perfect. Fear and wonder twined in the same spark. Deeper into the alley, you catch hushed accusations. A woman with herbs in her apron is called a witch, her knowledge of plants suddenly suspicious. Children whisper that she can curse cows with a glance. You know she's likely just an herbalist, yet fear reshapes her into a monster. In villages hollowed by death, suspicion grows like weeds in abandoned gardens. The tavern, of course, turns fear into parody. A singer belts out a tune mocking plague stars and witch cats. His lyrics absurd but catchy. People laugh hard, mugs slamming, ale spilling. Joke number 3 rides on the tune. If cats caused plague, mine's guilty of stealing sausages too. The laughter breaks the tension, but you know the mockery hides unease. As night deepens, you feel superstition curling tighter. Doors marked with chalk, whispers about unlucky numbers, children taught never to whistle after dark, lest spirits come calling. The city is alive, not just with memory of death, but with constant little rituals to keep it away. You move on, the cat-eyed glances of villagers following you, their hands clutching charms, their whispers clinging like cobwebs. Rational answers remain elusive, so superstition reigns, filling the silence left by empty pulpits and silent graveyards. The plague may be gone, but the fear it left behind is alive, mutating into myths, haunting every corner of the night. You wander out of those whispering, superstition-soaked alleys and toward the waterfront. The air sharpens with salt, tar, and fish, and you hear the hollow slap of waves against wooden hulls. Ships loom like dark silhouettes, their masts swaying against the sky. But unlike before the plague, these vessels don't just sail straight into port anymore. They hover offshore, restless shadows on the horizon, waiting. You quickly understand. You're watching the birth of quarantine. The mainstream historical fact here is clear. By the late 14th century, cities like Venice and Dubrovnik had begun enforcing strict quarantine rules. The very word comes from 40 giorni, 40 days, because ships suspected of carrying plague were kept at bay for that long before anyone could disembark. 40 days of waiting, 40 days of suspicion, 40 days of staring at land but not touching it. You stand on the pier, watching sailors wave weakly from decks, their faces pale, their eyes hungry for the shore. And the quirky tidbit? Guards sometimes refused to accept bribes, but they did accept gifts of fine wine and salted fish for their own health. Imagine being stuck offshore, desperate for freedom, and the best you can do is send care packages of snacks to the very men locking you out. Medieval corruption had a surprisingly foodie twist. Historians still argue whether quarantine was genuinely effective or merely a ritual of control. Did it truly halt contagion, or did it just make people feel safer? Some records suggest quarantined ships still slipped disease ashore. Others claim the practice genuinely slowed outbreaks. You feel the debate like a tug of tide beneath your boots, unsettled and unresolved. You walk along the pier where crates lie unopened, marked with chalk crosses. Merchants pace anxiously, watching goods spoil while officials insist on waiting. Tension buzzes in the salty air. One merchant snarls, "Rotting oranges don't spread plague. Lazy officials do." You almost laugh. Light joke number one, fruit being the scapegoat this time, but you also feel the sting of ruined livelihoods. Farther down the quay, a makeshift lazaretto, an isolation house, squats by the water. Its windows are shuttered, its doors sealed. Inside, sailors suspected of illness lie on straw beds, guarded by men with pikes who refuse to come too close. The smell seeping through the cracks is sharp. Sweat, vinegar, and fear. This is the city's new compromise. Sacrifice a few to save the many. The sensory experience overwhelms you. Gulls screech overhead, waves slap wood. The metallic tang of brine mixes with the stink of pitch and smoke. You hear the rasp of ropes against posts, the shouts of sailors begging for release, the muttered prayers of families waiting for fathers and sons who may never step ashore. One evening, you watch guards count the days by carving notches into a board. Each morning they check for signs of illness among sailors, coughs, swellings, fevers. If no one falls ill after 40 days, the ship earns its freedom. The number feels almost magical, less science than symbol, but the relief on sailors' faces when the board is cleared is genuine. You overhear a story of one clever captain who moored offshore and secretly rowed goods ashore under cover of night. When discovered, his punishment was public shaming, forced to sit at the harbour tied to a post while villagers pelted him with rotten fish. Quirky? Absolutely. Effective? Debatable. The smell alone probably scarred him worse than the punishment. Joke number 2 writes itself. Nothing says justice like being slapped in the face with a mackerel. Historians still argue whether quarantine represented the birth of public health policy or just a temporary panic measure. Was it the first spark of organized disease control, or was it medieval theatre with guards, boats, and chalk marks playing roles in a drama no one fully understood? You stand at the water's edge, uncertain but aware that something new has begun. At sunset, you see a procession of townsfolk carrying baskets of food to those quarantined inland. They leave the food on a table, step back, and let the sick approach. Nobody touches. Distance becomes law, separation, a strange kind of mercy. It feels cold but also oddly protective. Families wave from afar, tears glistening in the orange light. Night deepens. Torches line the docks, their flames jittering in the wind. Ships remain motionless shadows, 40-day prisoners of the sea. You realize this practice, born of fear, will echo across centuries, shaping how cities handle disease long after this plague fades. As you walk away, the gulls cry overhead, the waves slap against hulls, and the word quarantine echoes in your mind like a bell. Born here in salt air and fear, it will follow humanity forever. You leave the salt-stung air of the harbour and drift inland along rutted roads where lanterns swing from carts. The fields are restless, not because of wind, but because of people on the move. After the plague, wandering survivors begin crisscrossing the countryside. Workers, pilgrims, storytellers, even cheats, all searching for new lives. The stillness of death has given way to a shuffle of feet, a rustle of wheels, and the low murmur of voices asking, "Where can I start again?" The mainstream historical fact is this. After the Black Death, a massive labour shortage meant workers could demand better conditions, and many simply walked away from their old lords. This created waves of migration. Villages lost people overnight. Towns filled with newcomers offering strong backs for hire. A wandering mason might travel from city to city, welcomed with bread and ale because everyone needed walls built and roofs fixed. It was as if Europe itself became a job market, the countryside transformed into one long hiring fair. The quirky tidbit: not all wanderers were useful. Some clever fraudsters pretended to be plague survivors with special immunity, claiming their blood or breath could bless households. For a small fee, of course. You imagine one such conman swaggering through a town square, puffing out his chest. "Fear not, for I alone walked through death untouched." The villagers, half skeptical, half terrified, pay him anyway. Snake oil salesman, medieval edition. Historians still argue whether this great wandering broke down old loyalties forever or whether it was only a temporary ripple. Did these movements truly weaken feudal bonds, or did most workers eventually settle back into the same patterns once populations recovered? You picture the tension, nobles shouting, "Stay put," while peasants keep walking, free at last, to choose their own roads. You sit on a stone wall, by a crossroads, and watch the parade of humanity. A tinker pushes a cart clattering with pots. A shepherd leads goats, selling milk along the way. A widow carries baskets of herbs, offering remedies in each village. They all carry scars of loss, but their feet move with urgency. Behind them trudge orphans, barefoot, eyes sharp as if scanning for any chance to belong. The sensory details crowd in. Dust rises with every wagon wheel. Dogs bark at strangers. Alehouses glow at night, filled with unfamiliar voices telling familiar stories. You hear accents colliding, songs crossing borders, and gossip traded like currency. The world is suddenly bigger, stitched together by wandering feet. At one inn, you hear the laughter of mercenaries boasting about their travels. With fewer armies available, soldiers for hire became prized. They swagger, cups of ale sloshing, their stories half heroics, half outright lies. One claims he fought an army of ghosts. Another insists he killed a plague demon with a sword of silver. Joke number one writes itself. You think he's mostly killed barrels of beer. In another village, a wandering storyteller gathers children in the square, spinning tales of dragons, saints, and far-off cities where streets shine with gold. The children gape, wide-eyed, forgetting for a moment that their world has been hollowed by loss. Wandering isn't just about work, it's about carrying culture, weaving threads between communities that might otherwise collapse into silence. But not all travelers are welcomed. Guards at city gates eye newcomers with suspicion, fearing they might bring plague back. Some towns impose entry fees, others insist strangers spend a few nights in barns outside the walls before entering. Suspicion simmers alongside need. You watch a group of peasants beg for work, only to be turned away by a nervous magistrate. Their faces sag, but they huffle on to the next town. Survival is a pilgrimage now. Quirky detail number 2. Some survivors reinvent themselves with entirely new identities. With records lost and families gone, it's easy to claim a false past. You overhear a man in a tavern introducing himself as a master brewer, though his beer tastes like burnt porridge. The villagers drink it anyway, half because they want to believe him, half because there's no one left to prove him wrong. Historians still argue whether this fluidity of identity created the roots of a more mobile society, one where birth mattered less than skill, or at least confidence. Did the plague loosen the rigid hierarchy permanently, or did Europe eventually snap back to its old molds? Watching these travelers, you suspect the answer is both. Some chains reforged, others broke forever. As night deepens, you walk with a band of laborers headed to rebuild a church roof. They sing bawdy songs, one man joking that the only thing heavier than the stones they carry is the landlord's taxes. Joke number 3 lands with a round of laughter echoing into the dark. You feel the restless energy of the road. Grief still lingers, but it is harnessed by movement. The wandering survivors reshape Europe, not with armies or decrees, but with footsteps, wheels, and songs. Everywhere they go, they bring stories, labor, deceit, laughter, and change. And you, walking among them, realize you are part of this caravan of reinvention, a world in motion, rebuilt by those who refuse to stand still. You wander onward with the caravans of workers and storytellers until the road bends into a town buzzing with color. Stalls overflow with bolts of cloth, bright reds, blues, and greens so vivid they seem almost defiant against the shadows of death. Tailors lean out of shop fronts, shouting offers, scissors glinting in the sun. You pause, realizing something you hadn't expected. Even fashion itself has changed. The mainstream historical fact is this. After the Black Death, European clothing styles shifted dramatically. Tunics became shorter, more form-fitting, and fabrics bolder. Men wore hose that hugged their legs. Women adopted gowns with daringly lower necklines, and bright dyes once reserved for elites spilled into broader use. It was as if, after staring into the abyss, people dressed louder, brighter, and sharper, living proof that survival meant permission to stand out. Then comes the quirky tidbit. Some survivors literally wore plague masks as costume accessories during festivals, turning symbols of dread into satirical fashion. Imagine a reveler strutting through a carnival in a beaked mask bedazzled with colored beads, laughing as though mocking death itself, its gallows humor stitched in silk. Historians still argue whether this shift in clothing reflected genuine optimism or simply the economic reality that cheaper labor allowed tailors to experiment. Was bold fashion a rebellion against despair, or just an accident of supply and demand? As you finger a length of bright scarlet wool, you realize it was probably both. You step into a tailor's shop where apprentices dart between shelves stacked with cloth. One young man measures a client's leg, snipping hose so snug they look scandalous compared to the baggy trousers of his father's era. The client grins at his reflection in a polished plate, muttering, "If death comes tomorrow, I want to look alive today." The light joke number one, but it rings with truth. The sensory detail overwhelms you. Indigo dye stains the air with a sharp mineral scent. Wool brushes your fingertips, heavy and warm, while silks whisper cool against your palm. The sound of shears snapping, needles tapping, and coins clinking fills the room. Even the street outside glows brighter. Yellow hats, red boots, blue sleeves, a carnival of color against gray stone. As you wander deeper, you notice the social order written in fabric. Former peasants, suddenly richer from higher wages, now wear belts with silver clasps, daring to imitate the nobility. A noble woman hurries past, scandalized, muttering that commoners dress above their station. But her words sound hollow when her cloak hem is fraying, while the merchant beside her flaunts fresh velvet. Clothing becomes rebellion, thread and needle cutting through centuries of hierarchy. In the marketplace, a troupe of dancers swirls in costumes of vivid green, their sleeves trailing like banners. The crowd claps, laughter bubbling like ale. You hear one man joke that the only thing shorter than life is the new tunics. Joke number two lands perfectly, followed by whistles and applause. Historians still argue whether these changes were driven by psychology, people craving joy and display after so much loss, or by demographics, with younger survivors eager to distinguish themselves from the older generation. Either way, you can see the tension. Fashion becomes both an outlet and a weapon. To wear bold color is to declare, "I'm still here." At a dyer's workshop, vats of steaming liquid bubble with hues. Workers stir cloth with long poles, their hands stained purple and red. One dyer grins, telling you that so many nobles sold old wardrobes in desperation that dyes once hoarded for elites suddenly flooded the market. "Everyone wants red now," he says, "but I keep the best blue for myself." His stained grin proves the point. You glimpse children playing in oversized hand-me-down gowns, dragging velvet through the dust, pretending to be kings and queens. Death may have broken families, but in fashion, the scraps of nobility are stitched into new games, new identities. Even funerals change. Once draped in black alone, now mourners wear bands of bright color, reds for martyrs, greens for hope, signaling that death no longer erases expression, but amplifies it. You watch one procession where the widow wears scarlet sleeves, her tears glistening as bright as the fabric. Grief and flamboyance mix in strange harmony. Night falls and you drift into a tavern where young men boast about their newest doublets, sleeves puffed and slashed to show contrasting fabrics beneath. One laughs that he nearly fainted from the tight lacing, but insists it's worth it because girls notice. Joke number three lands with a chorus of groans and cheers. Vanity survives every plague. The tavern hums with fiddles and stomping boots. Women spin in gowns with flowing trains, their skirts brushing sawdust. The air reeks of ale, sweat and perfume, an intoxicating brew of survival. You sip your cup, watching the swirl of fabric, the glow of laughter, the shine of buttons catching firelight. Fashion here isn't just cloth, it's a declaration, a challenge, a dare to keep living boldly in a world that nearly ended. And as you leave the tavern, the streets ripple with color under the moonlight, every bright sleeve and daring neckline shouting into the night, "We are still alive, and we will be seen." You wander out of the tavern's swirl of fabrics and laughter, and the streets grow quieter, narrower, until you find yourself standing before the warm glow of a cottage window. Inside, a family gathers around a hearth. The smell of stew drifts out, earthy and comforting, but you sense the arrangement is different than before the plague. Something about the way chairs are filled, or not filled, tells you that family life itself has been reshaped. The mainstream historical fact is this: the Black Death radically altered inheritance patterns and family structures. With so many people gone, property passed unexpectedly to widows, orphans, and distant cousins. Marriages formed quickly, often within weeks of a spouse's death, as households scrambled to secure labor and keep lands from falling idle. Entire generations of children suddenly found themselves with wealth they never expected, or with nothing at all if relatives swooped in. The idea of family became elastic, stretched by survival. A quirky tidbit surfaces at the hearth. A boy boasts that he now owns 3 cows, though he's only 10 because everyone above him in the family tree is gone. His aunt chuckles and says, "Too bad the cows don't take orders from a child." You grin, half tragedy, half comedy, the absurdity of a child herding responsibility heavier than he is. Historians still argue whether the plague strengthened or weakened the family unit. Some evidence shows closer bonds, survivors clinging to one another fiercely. Other records suggest fragmentation, with widows remarrying quickly and children shuffled between households. Was family love intensified by loss or diluted by necessity? You feel both possibilities pressing in, as palpable as the smoke curling from the hearth. You step inside. The room is cramped but lively. A new husband sits awkwardly beside children clearly not his own, while their mother ladles stew. She smiles kindly, but the tension crackles. New families built out of loss, patched together like quilts of mismatched fabric. The stew smells rich with barley and pork, though you know the richness owes more to fewer mouths than to better harvests. At another cottage, you overhear a widow telling neighbors she married her farmhand within a month of her husband's burial. "Better a quick match than empty fields," she explains. The neighbors nod. No scandal here, only practicality. Marriage becomes less about romance and more about logistics. Survival demands speed, even in love. Joke number 1 forms in your mind. Medieval dating apps would simply read, "Widowed, owns 2 goats, needs help plowing." Inheritance reshuffles not just wealth, but dynamics. Orphaned children suddenly become prized wards, because whoever fosters them controls their property until adulthood. You catch wind of uncles squabbling over who gets custody, their generosity tinged with greed. Children, meanwhile, grow sharper, quicker, more independent, learning early that survival depends on wit as much as guardians. The sensory details swell. The creak of benches as families crowd together at meals, the clatter of spoons, the sigh of wind slipping through patched roofs. You hear lullabies sung softer now, less playful, more protective. Parents hold children tighter, as if sheer force of love might guard them from invisible threats. At one gathering, a grandfather recalls how, before the plague, marriages were long negotiations with dowries and feasts. Now, he mutters, couples wed in plain chapels with barely a witness, simply to claim land before a cousin swoops in. Quirky tidbit number 2. One chronicle notes a man who married 3 times in a single year, each wife buried before the next vow. It sounds like a grim marathon of survival through matrimony. Historians still argue whether these quick unions cheapened marriage or simply changed its role. Was love diminished or redefined in urgency? You lean against a doorframe, unsure, watching couples hold hands tenderly even in haste. Perhaps grief made their affections sharper, if shorter. You stroll through a street at dusk, children chasing one another in hand-me-down velvet from noble houses now empty. Their laughter rings clear, though beneath it you sense fragility. These children grow up with fewer elders to guide them, forced into roles too soon. You picture one boy inheriting not just a farm, but also debts, learning to haggle before he learns to write. Joke number 2, you hear him mutter to a goat, "Pay rent or leave." Even the animals get dragged into new hierarchies. And women, wives, widows, mothers, step into spaces once closed. Some manage estates, sign contracts, even hire workers. In the absence of men, their authority expands. A woman in a blue gown waves at you proudly from her doorway, declaring she runs her vineyard alone now. Her neighbors may grumble, but the coins clinking in her purse silence them. The night deepens, and you pass a farmhouse where a family sits in silence, 3 empty chairs around the hearth. They eat quietly, each spoon scraping louder than the last. Not all families were patched together, some simply hollowed out. Grief fills those seats more heavily than any new spouse or child could. Joke number 3 floats lightly on the wind from a group of teenagers laughing outside. One boy says he'll marry the first girl who can bake bread without burning it. Laughter breaks the tension, the air lighter for a moment. Even humor becomes inheritance now, a survival trait passed as carefully as land. You walk on, sensing the weight and flux of kinship. Families shrink, expand, fracture and fuse. Love persists, but it bends under necessity, reshaping itself like molten metal. In every cottage, every marriage bed, every orphaned child clutching a too large cloak, you see it, family life, reshaped by death, patched together with urgency, resilience, and stubborn hope. You drift away from the cottages and patched together households until the road widens and you begin to hear the distant thud of boots on sodden earth. The smell of smoke and iron sharpens the air. Before you stretches a field scarred by trenches where banners sag on broken poles. It is here that you sense another ripple of change, the echo of plague on the art of war. The mainstream historical fact is straightforward. The Black Death reduced populations so drastically that armies shrank in size. Fewer men were available for feudal levies, forcing lords and kings to rethink how wars were fought. Smaller forces relied more heavily on strategy, mobility, and, most dramatically, the growing use of professional soldiers and mercenaries. Warfare became leaner, sharper, and, in some ways, more brutal. Quirky tidbit. Chroniclers describe villages so short on fighting men that priests were drafted into militia duty, swinging swords between prayers. Imagine lining up in formation next to a monk still clutching his rosary with one hand and a rusty halberd in the other, half divine blessing, half battlefield liability. Historians still argue whether the plague directly accelerated military innovation or if broader political conflicts would have brought those changes anyway. Was the longbow's prominence in England, or the reliance on Swiss pike formations, truly a plague effect, or just history's natural progression? You crouch at the edge of a muddy trench, pondering whether absence itself shaped tactics as much as invention. You step onto the battlefield. The air is heavy with damp earth and the faint reek of unburied dead. Horses snort nervously, their ribs sharp beneath patchy coats. Commanders bark orders to ranks that look skeletal compared to pre-plague hosts. Fewer soldiers means each one counts more. Discipline tightens, weapons specialize, a bowman cannot be replaced. Easily, his skill is worth more than the coin in his pouch. The sensory details press in, the clang of swords against bucklers, the dull thunk of arrows sinking into straw targets during practice, the acrid smell of pitch-soaked rags readied for fire. You hear mercenaries laughing around a campfire, boasting of contracts with whichever lord pays best. Loyalty now lies less in oaths of fealty, more in jingling purses. At one camp you see an odd sight. Wooden dummies dressed in armor propped upright in a line. Soldiers practice maneuvers against them, swinging with precision. A sergeant explains there aren't enough men to spar safely, so the dummies must stand in for real bodies. Light joke number 1. Even training armies are half imaginary. Further along you find smaller castles fortified with cannons and bombards, primitive but booming symbols of a new age. Stone walls shiver under the roar of gunpowder echoing across valleys. Lords can no longer rely purely on masses of men-at-arms. Technology steps into the void left by plague losses. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some chronicles record peasants using slings and farm tools in skirmishes because professional weapons were too scarce. A farmer armed with a flail might face a knight and, to everyone's surprise, sometimes win. The lines between soldier and farmer blur. Historians still argue whether these shifts democratized warfare, giving commoners a larger role, or whether they merely changed the tools of elite power. Did plague losses open doors for ordinary fighters, or did nobles still hold the reins? Watching peasants practice pike drills under a banner, you see both possibilities flicker. You wander through a camp kitchen where stew bubbles in a massive cauldron. Men joke about their rations, one quipping that the plague at least killed fewer chickens than lords' appetites did. Joke number 2 lands, drawing tired chuckles. Humor becomes armor too, dulling the edge of fear. Marching resumes at dawn. You trudge alongside the soldiers, their boots squelching in mud. The columns look thin, but the discipline is fierce. Each man glances nervously at the empty space where more comrades should be. Smaller armies move faster, but the gaps are impossible to ignore. You overhear commanders whisper about coin, hiring mercenaries, buying bows, affording gunpowder. War itself becomes more expensive as scarcity drives up wages. One knight grumbles that peasants demand as much gold for swinging a pike as he earns in rents. Joke number 3. Another replies, "At least peasants don't charge extra for bringing their own flails." The group roars, laughter mixing with fatigue. As evening falls, the field glows red with sunset. Soldiers sharpen blades, mend boots, and sing low songs of home. You stand among them, aware that plague reshaped their world as surely as battle did. Armies are smaller, faster, stranger. Loyalty is bought more often than sworn. The roar of cannons grows louder with each campaign, the weight of feudal levies lighter. The plague may not have swung swords, but it thinned ranks, shifted tactics, and opened space for new forms of war. You leave the camp behind, footsteps crunching over trampled earth, carrying with you the sense that even war itself learned to adapt to absence. You leave the smoky camps and trampled fields behind, walking toward a city square, alive with noise not of battle, but of sketches, songs, and ideas. The clang of swords fades, replaced by the scratch of charcoal on parchment, the hum of voices reading aloud, the pluck of lutes echoing off stone walls. It feels as if the shadow of death has been turned inside out and something new is taking root, the earliest sparks of the Renaissance. The mainstream historical fact is this: after the Black Death, a surge of cultural and intellectual activity began to stir in Europe, especially in Italy. Wealthier survivors funneled money into art, architecture, and education. Labor shortages pushed innovation, while the trauma of loss inspired reflection. In Florence in particular, patrons like the Medici would later transform these embers into a blaze of creativity. But the kindling starts here, in survivors sketching, experimenting, and daring to look at the human body and the natural world in fresh ways. Quirky tidbit: some of the earliest anatomy studies came from quietly dissecting bodies of plague victims, long after burial laws tried to forbid it. Imagine creeping into a graveyard at night, lantern in one hand, scalpel in the other, just to sketch the curve of a rib or the hinge of a jaw. Macabre? Absolutely. Revolutionary? Without question. You feel a chill, equal parts dread and awe, at how curiosity clawed its way even through death. Historians still argue whether the plague directly birthed the Renaissance or merely accelerated it. Did death shock people into new ways of thinking, or was the Renaissance already inevitable? You can almost hear the debate echoing through guild halls, one voice shouting that suffering forced innovation, another insisting it was trade, wealth, and politics. Perhaps it was both, tangled like vines on a wall. You step into a workshop, an apprentice bends over a wooden panel, brushing gold leaf around a Madonna, while beside him another quietly sketches not saints, but the muscles of a hand. The contrast is striking. Heavenly devotion alongside raw curiosity about the human body. Both forms of expression grow from the same soil of survival. The sensory details surround you. The tang of wet plaster from frescoes drying on walls, the smell of ink in scriptoriums where monks copy texts, slipping in marginal doodles of plague carts. The hum of song drifting from taverns, not dirges this time, but ballads with a lighter lilt. The city feels restless, expectant, like a garden pushing green shoots through soil still flecked with ash. In a square, you find an architect pointing at a model of a dome. He argues that churches should rise not in cramped Gothic spikes, but in sweeping, balanced harmony. Townsfolk tilt their heads, squinting as though unsure whether they see vision or madness. The architect grins, declaring, "If we survived the plague, we can build anything." Light joke number 1, delivered with the certainty of a man who's watched too much fall to fear limits. Elsewhere, students huddle over translations of ancient Greek texts rediscovered and copied after being neglected for centuries. Aristotle, Galen, even fragments of Plato circulate, sparking debates in taverns as well as lecture halls. You overhear one young scholar arguing that studying nature itself brings you closer to God than repeating prayers blindly. His friend counters with a nervous laugh, warning him not to say that too loudly. Ideas, like plague, spread quickly, sometimes dangerously. Quirky tidbit number 2. Artists painted skeletons not just as grim reminders but as models of anatomy, adding a strange precision to their Dance of Death murals. You spot one panel where a skeleton's ribcage is lovingly detailed, almost tender, as if the artist admired its structure even while fearing its meaning. It's both science and art, dressed in bones. Historians still argue whether this new energy came from wealth trickling down to survivors or from trauma itself, the urge to find meaning after devastation. Were these sparks born of coins jingling in merchants' pockets, or of restless souls unwilling to let silence be the only memorial? You watch as a mason chips careful lines into stone, his eyes gleaming with focus, and you realize the answer is probably both. Night falls and torches flare along arcades where poets recite verses about fleeting life and sudden joy. A bard strums a lute, joking that at least death makes good rhyme schemes. Joke number 2 lands easily, the crowd laughing at the thought of plague as a poetic muse. Even laughter feels sharper, like it's been honed against grief. The streets glow with frescoes, verses, sketches, and music. People sip wine under colonnades, debating the balance of symmetry and beauty, the dignity of human beings, the meaning of survival itself. Death no longer silences, it provokes loudly, colourfully, endless, sly. In a quieter courtyard, you see a painter leaning over his sketchbook. He studies a child's hand by candlelight, tracing the lines carefully. You can almost feel his mind shifting, away from symbols and toward flesh, away from abstractions and toward the human itself. That spark, small and trembling, is the seed of something vast. As you walk away, the hum of creativity follows you, woven with laughter and argument. The plague cut deep, but out of the wound comes art, science, and invention, the first shoots of a renaissance. And you, wandering through these alleys, realize you're seeing not just survival, but rebirth. You drift away from torchlit courtyards filled with poets and painters until the noise thins into quiet lanes. Here the voices are softer, not performed for crowds, but murmured between families, scribbled on parchment, whispered across fences. It's not kings or merchants speaking now. It's ordinary survivors. Letters, wills, and gossip carry their echoes, small but piercing. The mainstream historical fact is this: personal writings from the decades after the Black Death give us rare glimpses into how common people processed grief and resilience. Chronicles record the scale, yes, but wills, marginal notes, and village accounts show the human pulse: fear, gratitude, bitterness, even strange luck. You lean against a doorframe where a clerk copies a will, the quill scratching slower than usual, as if weighted by sorrow. Quirky tidbit: some survivors added odd requests to their wills, like demanding that mourners be given pastries at their funerals or insisting that their pet dogs be buried with them. You picture a baker's widow instructing, "Serve almond cakes at my burial feast, so at least people leave full." It's half grim, half practical, and you can almost taste the sweet crumbs dissolving in a mouth still salty with tears. Historians still argue whether these survivor voices reflect real shifts in mentality or if they're exceptions that happened to survive on paper. Did ordinary people truly become more self-aware, more reflective after plague, or are we just lucky to have a handful of texts preserved? The debate itself feels fragile, like a scrap of parchment saved from fire. You sit with a family as they dictate a will. The father, gaunt but alive, insists his land go to his daughters, not his brothers, because the girls kept him fed when death was near. The scribe hesitates, unused to such declarations, then shrugs and writes it down. You feel the weight of a mo, meant where affection bends rules, ink binding gratitude into law. The sensory details build around you, candles flicker, dripping wax onto wood, a pot of cabbage stew simmers in the background. Children whisper outside, chasing one another past doorways where adults argue over property lines. The world hums with conversations, each one both ordinary and monumental. In a marketplace, you overhear gossip. A woman swears her neighbor's survival came only because he bribed death with silver. A man retorts that luck had nothing to do with it. His chickens ate better than half the village. Joke number 1 delivered with laughter bubbling despite the bitterness. Even grief makes room for petty rivalry. You pause by a parish register. The priest notes marriages springing up faster than funerals now, scribbling in weary Latin. Between the lines you can feel him sigh, his pen tired from recording so much death, now stumbling over sudden bursts of life. His handwriting grows almost playful when he writes the names of children baptized as if relief seeps into his script. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some letters describe bizarre strokes of luck. One man bragged that he inherited 5 houses simply because everyone else in his extended family died. I never thought I'd be rich, he writes, but here I sit in my cousin's bed, eating his goose. Morbid, greedy, but real. Survival sometimes tasted of opportunity, and survivors did not shy away from admitting it. Historians still argue whether we should read these accounts as typical or exceptional. Were most survivors hardened or tenderized by tragedy? Did they see themselves as chosen, cursed, or just lucky dice? You walk along lanes lit by moonlight, sensing all 3 answers at once. In a tavern, a man stands to tell his story. He lost wife, parents, and 2 children, yet he laughs while boasting he can now afford a second cow. His friends cheer, mugs raised. The laughter sounds jagged, as if the joy is forced through scar tissue. Joke number 2 slips in. He says he'll name the cow Death, because at least it feeds him instead of stealing from him. The table erupts, equal parts cheer and grim knowing. You move past a cottage where a mother hushes her child. She murmurs stories of neighbors who vanished, yet also sings lullabies, stitching memory and comfort together. Survivors pass down their experience not as grand chronicles, but as bedtime warnings and gentle whispers. Life is fragile, love fiercely. A scribe shows you a collection of letters from merchants, their handwriting clumsy but their words sharp. One writes, "I have survived, but my customers have not." Another notes that the streets of Bruges are quiet as a grave, yet my coin purses are heavy. Survival produces strange mixtures of grief and guilt, riches and loneliness. Joke number 3 comes from a farmer carving words on a fence post. Death skipped me because even he knew my stew was terrible. Crude humor, scratched into wood, but you laugh out loud. Even the fence becomes testimony. The night settles heavy, but the voices do not stop. They linger in wills, in songs, in gossip, in carved jokes. They are messy, contradictory, painfully human. You walk on, realizing that history is not only battles and decrees, but these tiny testimonies. Voices of survivors, stubborn and strange, echoing down the centuries. You wander on from cottages where gossip lingers in wood smoke and wills are scratched in candlelight until the road grows hushed again. The air cools, the stars stretch wide, and you sense that time itself has slowed. Generations pass, yet the memory of the Black Death still presses down like a heavy quilt. You begin to feel how the plague's long shadow never truly lifts, it simply changes shape. The mainstream historical fact is this: even a century after the Black Death, Europe still carried its imprint. Population recovery was sluggish, taking until the 1500s for numbers to return to pre-plague levels. Architecture, art, law, and even diets bore marks of the crisis. The dread of sudden mass death remained stitched into the culture, resurfacing every time new outbreaks appeared. The plague was never fully gone. It returned in waves, each smaller but still deadly. Quirky tidbit. In some villages, people swore the plague itself was a ghost, an old woman in rags walking the lanes at night, knocking on doors. If you heard her knock and opened, death entered. If you stayed silent, you lived. Imagine an entire town holding its breath at the sound of wood creaking after dark, convinced the visitor was invisible and unstoppable. Historians still argue whether the Black Death left Europe stronger, more innovative, more socially flexible, or permanently scarred. Was the Renaissance born from plague's upheaval, or would it have blossomed anyway? Was serfdom's decline a revolution of freedom, or just a hiccup until nobility found new chains? You hear both verdicts whispered on the wind, as unresolved as the riddle of the plague's origin itself. You pause at a marketplace, quieter than the bustling ones you saw earlier in your journey. Here old men tell children stories about the great mortality. Their words are heavy with fear, but also shaped into lessons. Keep clean water, or bury the dead with care, share bread with neighbors. Memory itself becomes a kind of law, guiding behavior long after the carts stopped rolling. The sensory details are softer now. The creak of windmills turning lazily on the horizon, the faint hiss of lamps as oil burns low, the scent of bread cooling on a windowsill mixed with damp moss rising from stone walls. Life feels fragile but steady, like a flame cupped in hands. You watch a farmer instruct his son how to plow, pausing to remind him, remember, life can vanish quickly, work hard but love harder. His voice trembles, shaped by the ghost of plague years long past. A neighbor nods, adding that no field, no coin, no church bell means much if families aren't tended like crops. Ordinary wisdom, forged in extraordinary loss. Joke number 1 drifts from a group of teenagers nearby, poking fun at their elders' constant warnings. If death comes back, he'll be bored stiff watching us weed cabbages. Their laughter is loud, nervous, but alive. Humor still weaves through fear, keeping it from choking the air. You pass a church where frescoes fade on the walls, skeletons in their eternal dance now cracked and peeling. Yet people still pray beneath them, their heads bowed, their voices steady. Faith limps, but does not vanish. It simply adapts, like everything else. Quirky tidbit number 2. In some families, children born after the plague were given names like Benedictus, the Blessed, or Beatrix, the Fortunate, as if to brand survival into their very identities. Every introduction became a reminder, we lived when others did not. You hear the names whispered at a baptism and feel the gravity stitched into syllables. Historians still argue whether this constant reminder of mortality bred resilience or despair. Did living in the plague's shadow make people bolder or more anxious? As you listen to villagers' siestas, hair stories, you sense it did both, depending on the heart that carried it. As twilight deepens, you walk among generations shaped by memory. Grandparents tell tales of empty streets. Parents urge gratitude for bread and wine. Children listen wide-eyed, half fearful, half bored. Memory bends, but does not break. The long shadow of plague becomes part of life itself, etched into lullabies, laughter and laws. Joke number 3 arrives at a bonfire where villagers roast chestnuts. A boy shouts, "If death comes back, he better bring marshmallows." The crowd laughs, fire crackling, fear disarmed by jest. Even centuries later, laughter remains the best rebellion. You step back, the night sky enormous above you, voices fading into the hum of crickets and distant bells. The world did not end with the Black Death. It bent, reshaped, and staggered forward, carrying scars and songs alike. And you, drifting with the survivors, realize that history itself is haunted not just by death, but by the stubborn insistence on living anyway. Now, the road quiets, your footsteps slow. The clang of hammers, the chatter of markets, the whispers of superstition, all fade like smoke carried on a gentle breeze. The candlelight of taverns dims behind you, replaced by the steady glow of stars, patient and timeless. You feel the weight of centuries lift, as though the stories you've wandered through are exhaling at last. The plague is gone now, or at least its loudest voice has gone silent. What remains is softer, a field of wheat swaying in night air, a lullaby hummed at a cradle, the crackle of a fire where laughter lingers. Your pace eases with the rhythm of breath. Inhale, steady. Exhale, slow. Each step you imagine is lighter than the last. You walk not through ruins now, but through recovery. Villages rebuilt, families gathered, art blooming where fear once lay thick. The bones of history rest beneath your feet, but above them rise arches, songs, and gentle smiles. As you drift further, words themselves grow hushed. Bells no longer warn, they toll quietly for evening prayer. Doors no longer slam shut, they swing open for neighbors sharing bread. Even the cats, once hunted in superstition, curl lazily in windows, content. Let your shoulders loosen, your breath deepen. Let memory soften into comfort, like a quilt pulled to the chin. You are safe now, listening in the quiet company of centuries. The world has carried its burdens, and you've carried them too. But here, right now, you can set them down. The story rests. Your eyelids grow heavy. The long shadow of the Black Death fades into silence, leaving only the hum of resilience, the whisper of survival, the calm of sleep approaching. And so we end. Softly, gently, sweet dreams.